On a Tuesday morning in September of 1992, Frank Donnelly stood at the edge of a swamp and watched his career sink into the mud. 3 days earlier, his company's newest piece of equipment, a Caterpillar 375 excavator, $600,000 of hydraulic power and computerized precision, had broken through what the surveyors promised was solid ground. The machine had dropped like a stone, its 60-ton weight punching through the thin crust of dried earth into the bottomless black muck beneath. Now the excavator sat in the swamp like a wounded dinosaur, buried to its cab, its yellow paint streaked with mud, its tracks completely invisible beneath the surface. Every hour, it seemed to sink another inch. Frank had tried everything. On the first day, he'd brought in 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers and chained them to the stuck machine. The bulldozers had pulled until their own tracks started to slip, until the chains groaned and one of them snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The excavator hadn't moved an inch. On the second day, he'd called in a recovery company from Des Moines, specialists in heavy equipment extraction. They'd brought a truck with a 50-ton winch and anchored it to a concrete foundation half a mile away. The winch had screamed, the cable had stretched, and the anchor had ripped out of the ground. The excavator had sunk another 6 inches. On the third day, Frank had rented a crane. The crane operator had taken one look at the swamp, shaken his head, and refused to get within 100 feet of the edge. "That ground won't hold me," he'd said. "You want 2 machines stuck instead of 1? Now Frank stood with his engineers, looking at a piece of equipment worth more than most houses, slowly disappearing into the earth. "What about a helicopter?" one of the engineers suggested. "A sky crane could lift it." "A sky crane costs $15,000 an hour," Frank said, "and the nearest one is in Minnesota. By the time it gets here, that excavator will be underground. We could drain the swamp." "With what? That swamp is fed by an underground spring. We'd need a month and $1 million. Insurance?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Insurance doesn't cover operator error. And according to the fine print, driving into a swamp counts as operator error." The engineers fell silent. They were running out of options, and they knew it. That's when the John Deere tractor pulled up to the edge of the construction site. Let me tell you about Walter Brennan, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Walter was 73 years old and had farmed the same 400 acres in Clayton County for 50 years. His land bordered the construction site, or what would become Highway 52 when Donnelly Construction finished the job. Walter had watched the construction crews arrive 6 months ago, watched them survey and grade and pour concrete, watched them bring in equipment that cost more than his entire farm was worth. He hadn't complained when the noise scared his cattle. He hadn't complained when the construction traffic tore up the county road. He hadn't even complained when the project manager told him he'd need to relocate his fence line because the original survey had been wrong. Walter Brennan wasn't a complainer. He was a watcher. And he'd been watching this stuck excavator for 3 days, waiting to see if the construction company would figure it out. They hadn't. So Walter drove his John Deere to the edge of the site, climbed down, and walked over to where Frank Donnelly stood with his engineers. "Morning," Walter said. Frank barely glanced at him. "Morning. Site's closed to visitors. Insurance liability. I'm not a visitor. I'm your neighbor. Own the land on the other side of that tree line." Walter nodded toward the stuck excavator. "Saw your problem. Thought I might be able to help." Now Frank looked at him, looked at the worn overalls, the mud-caked boots, the 73-year-old face weathered by half a century of Iowa weather. "Help how? I can pull that out." The words hung in the air. The engineers exchanged glances. Someone coughed. Frank Donnelly started to laugh. Let me tell you about that laugh, because it's important to the story. Frank Donnelly was 45 years old and had built Donnelly Construction from nothing. He'd started with one backhoe and a pickup truck, worked 18-hour days for 20 years, and turned himself into the biggest contractor in eastern Iowa. He employed 150 men. He had equipment worth millions. He'd built bridges and highways and shopping centers and schools. Frank Donnelly was not a humble man. Success had taught him that he was smarter than most people, harder working than most people, better than most people. When he looked at Walter Brennan, at the old farmer in his worn clothes with his ancient tractor, he saw everything he'd spent his life proving he wasn't. So he laughed. "You can pull that out," Frank repeated, still laughing. "With what, Grandpa? Your John Deere? That excavator weighs 60 tons. Your tractor weighs, what, 5? "Not with the John Deere," Walter said calmly. "With my steamer." "Your what?" "My steam traction engine. Case 1912 model, 110 horsepower. She's been in my family for 80 years. The laughter spread now. The engineers were chuckling. The workers had stopped what they were doing to listen. Frank wiped his eyes. "A steam tractor. From 1912. You want to pull out my $600,000 excavator with a steam tractor from 9? That's right, buddy. I've got bulldozers that make more horsepower than your whole farm. They couldn't move that excavator an inch. What makes you think some antique is going to do better?" Walter looked at the stuck excavator, then at the bulldozers sitting uselessly at the edge of the swamp, then back at Frank. "Your machines make horsepower," Walter said. "Mine makes torque. There's a difference. Enlighten me." "Horsepower is how fast you can do work. Torque is how much work you can do. Your bulldozers spin fast, but they can't grip. They're designed for pushing dirt on solid ground, not pulling dead weight out of a swamp. My steamer was designed to pull threshing machines through muddy fields all day long. 6-foot drive wheels with steel cleats. Weighs 22 tons herself. She doesn't spin, she grips." Frank shook his head, still smiling. "This is adorable. Really. But I've got a real problem here, and I don't have time for—" "You've had 3 days," Walter interrupted quietly. "You've tried bulldozers. You've tried winches. You've tried a crane that wouldn't even get close. You're losing $20,000 a day in delays. You're out of options." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not charging you anything. If it doesn't work, you've lost nothing but an hour of your time. If it does work, you can make a donation to the Clayton County Historical Society. They're the ones who helped me restore that engine." Frank looked at Walter for a long moment. Then he looked at his engineers, who shrugged. "Fine," Frank said. "Bring your museum piece. When it falls apart trying to move that excavator, at least it'll give my men something to laugh about. Let me tell you about the steam engine, because it's the real hero of this story." The Case 110 horsepower steam traction engine had been built in Racine, Wisconsin in 1912, the same year the Titanic sank and Woodrow Wilson was elected president. It was a monster of a machine, 22 tons of iron and steel, with rear drive wheels 6 feet in diameter studded with steel cleats designed to grip any surface. The boiler could hold 150 gallons of water and generate enough steam pressure to move mountains. Walter's grandfather, August Brennan, had bought the engine new for $3,200, a fortune in 1912, more than most farms cost. August had used it for 20 years, pulling threshing machines from farm to farm during harvest season, dragging stumps out of fields being cleared for planting, doing the heavy work that horses couldn't handle. When gasoline tractors became common in the 1930s, most farmers scrapped their steamers. The old machines were expensive to operate, slow to start, and required constant attention, but August Brennan couldn't bear to part with his. He'd parked it in a shed behind the barn and covered it with canvas, thinking he might need it again someday. He never did. August died in 1952, and the steam engine sat untouched for another 30 years. Walter had rediscovered it in 1984, when he was cleaning out the old shed to make room for equipment storage. He'd pulled back the canvas and found the engine exactly as his grandfather had left it, rusty, dusty, but intact. Every part was still there. The boiler still held pressure when he tested it. The gears still turned when he cranked them by hand. Walter had spent 3 years restoring the engine. He'd found a retired machinist in Dubuque who remembered working on steamers in his youth. He'd tracked down original parts from collectors and museums across the Midwest. He'd learned to operate the machine from old manuals and older men who still remembered the age of steam. By 1987, the case was running again. Walter took it to county fairs and steam shows, demonstrated it for school groups, kept it in perfect working condition. He fired up the boiler once a month, just to keep everything moving, just to hear the whistle echo across the Iowa flatland. He'd always known the old machine was powerful. He'd just never had a chance to prove how powerful. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known you could do something that everyone else said was impossible? Have you ever felt that certainty in your bones, that quiet confidence that comes from understanding something deeply, something the experts with their degrees and their equipment don't understand? Walter Brennan had that feeling as he drove his John Deere back to his farm to get the steam engine. He'd watched the construction crews struggle for 3 days. He'd watched their bulldozers spin uselessly, their winches strain and fail. He'd watched and thought about torque, about traction, about the difference between power and grip. He knew his grandfather's machine could do what their modern equipment couldn't. He just needed the chance to prove it. Let me tell you about the arrival, because that's when the real show began. It took Walter 2 hours to fire up the steam engine. You couldn't just start a steamer like you started a tractor. You had to build a fire, heat the water, let the pressure build slowly until the gauges showed you were ready. Walter had done it hundreds of times, but he never rushed. Steam under pressure was dangerous if you didn't respect it. By noon, the engine was ready. Walter drove it out of the shed and down the county road toward the construction site, moving at a stately 5 miles per hour, black smoke rising from the stack, steam hissing from the valves. Drivers pulled over to stare. Kids pointed from their yards. A machine like this hadn't traveled these roads in half a century. The construction crew heard him coming before they saw him. First the sound, a deep, rhythmic chuffing, like the breathing of some enormous animal. Then the ground vibration, the steel cleats biting into the gravel road with each rotation of the massive wheels. Then the whistle, as Walter announced his arrival, a shriek of steam that echoed across the flat Iowa landscape and made every head turn. The steam engine crested the small rise that overlooked the construction site, and for a moment, everyone just stared. The machine was enormous. It dwarfed Walter's John Deere the way a grizzly bear dwarfs a house cat. The boiler gleamed black, freshly painted and polished. The brass fittings caught the September sun. The drive wheels, 6 feet tall and studded with cleats, turned slowly as Walter guided the engine down the slope toward the swamp. Frank Donnelly stood with his arms crossed, watching. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. "Jesus Christ," one of the engineers muttered. "Look at the size of that thing." "It's an antique," Frank said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Belongs in a museum." Walter drove the steam engine to the edge of the swamp, about 200 feet from the stuck excavator. He set the brake, climbed down, and began uncoiling a chain from the back of the machine. Not just any chain. A chain with links as thick as a man's wrist. Forged steel that had been in Walter's family as long as the engine itself. "That chain won't hold," one of the engineers said. "We snapped a cable rated for 50 tons. This chain is rated for 80. Walter said calmly. "And it's got some give to it. Steel cable doesn't stretch. When it hits its limit, it snaps. Chain stretches a little before it breaks. Gives you time to back off." He walked the chain out toward the excavator, his boots sinking into the mud with each step. The ground was soft, but not bottomless. There was solid earth beneath the muck, maybe 4 or 5 feet down. Walter could feel it with each step. The construction crew watched in silence as the old man waded through the swamp, chain over his shoulder, until he reached the stuck excavator. He hooked the chain to the machine's frame, tested the connection, then waded back to solid ground. By the time he reached the steam engine, he was covered in mud up to his chest. He didn't seem to notice. "You sure about this, old-timer?" Frank called out. There was less mockery in his voice now, more genuine concern. "That machine's worth more than your whole farm. If something goes wrong, then I'll owe you an excavator," Walter said. "But nothing's going to go wrong." He climbed up onto the steam engine's platform, checked his pressure gauges, and put his hand on the throttle. "Let me tell you about the next 3 minutes, because they're the reason this story is still being told. Walter opened the throttle. The steam engine responded with a sound that nobody on that construction site had ever heard before. A deep, resonant chunk, chunk, chunk as the pistons began to drive, as the gears engaged, as 80 years of engineering came to life. The drive wheels started to turn. They didn't spin. They didn't slip. The steel cleats bit into the ground like teeth, each one finding purchase, each one gripping solid earth beneath the soft surface mud. The chain went taut. In the cab of the stuck excavator, the dashboard rattled. The whole machine groaned, metal stressed by forces it had never experienced. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the excavator moved. Not much. An inch. Maybe 2. But it moved forward. Out of the hole that had trapped it for 3 days. "Holy shit," someone said. Walter didn't hear. He was focused on the pressure gauge, on the throttle, on the sound of the engine. He pushed the throttle a little further. The steam engine's chuffing grew louder, more urgent. The drive wheels turned faster, the cleats tearing into the ground, throwing mud behind them. The chain hummed with tension. The excavator moved again, a foot this time, then another foot. The construction crew was screaming now, not in panic, but in disbelief. They were watching a 60-ton machine being pulled out of a swamp by something their great-grandfathers might have used. Walter kept the throttle steady. The steam engine kept pulling. 5 feet. 10 feet. The excavator was rising now, the mud releasing its grip with a series of sucking sounds, the tracks emerging black and dripping from the swamp. 20 feet. 30 feet. The excavator was out. Walter pulled it another 100 feet, just to be safe, until the machine sat on solid ground, muddy, battered, but intact. Then he closed the throttle, set the brake, and let out the steam whistle. The sound echoed across the Iowa flatland, a triumphant scream, the same sound that had announced the arrival of harvest crews 100 years ago, the same sound that had echoed across these fields when Walter's grandfather was young. The construction crew erupted. Men were cheering, slapping each other on the back, pointing at the steam engine and the excavator and the old man who had done what their $1 million of modern equipment couldn't do. Frank Donnelly stood absolutely still. His face had gone pale. His arms had dropped to his sides. He looked at the steam engine, at the ancient, obsolete museum-piece steam engine, and then at his excavator, sitting on solid ground for the first time in 3 days. He looked at Walter Brennan, covered in mud, standing on the platform of a machine from and he didn't say a word. Now let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in the mud. Walter drove the steam engine home that afternoon, moving slowly down the county road while cars honked and people waved. The story was already spreading. Phone calls, word of mouth, the ancient telegraph of rural communities. By evening, everyone in Clayton County knew what had happened at the construction site. Frank Donnelly showed up at Walter's farm the next morning. Walter was in the barn, cleaning mud off the steam engine's wheels, when he heard the truck pull into his driveway. He kept working, not turning around, until Frank's shadow fell across the floor. "Mr. Brennan, Mr. Donnelly." Frank stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the steam engine. In the daylight, with the mud cleaned off and the brass polished, it looked less like a rescue machine and more like what it was, a beautiful piece of engineering from another era. "I came to apologize," Frank said finally. Walter kept cleaning. "Nothing to apologize for. I laughed at you, in front of my whole crew. I called your machine a museum piece, called you Grandpa, acted like you were wasting my time. You did. I was wrong." Walter stopped cleaning and looked at Frank for the first time. "Yes, you were. How did you know? How did you know that thing could pull out my excavator when nothing else could?" Walter set down his rag and leaned against the steam engine's massive wheel. "My grandfather bought this machine in He used it for 20 years, pulling threshers through mud that would have swallowed a team of horses. He used to say that modern machines were built for speed, but his steamer was built for work. For the kind of work where you can't go fast, where you just have to keep pulling until the job is done. But the technology is exactly the same as it was 80 years ago. Steam pressure pushing pistons, pistons turning gears, gears turning wheels. No computers to tell it when to stop, no sensors to protect it from overload. Just pressure and steel and a man who knows how to use them. Walter patted the iron boiler. Your bulldozers have more horsepower than this machine. But horsepower isn't what you needed. You needed torque, raw pulling power, delivered slow and steady. You needed wheels that grip instead of spin. You needed a machine that doesn't know when to quit. He looked at Frank. Your modern equipment is designed to protect itself. When it senses too much load, it backs off. When the wheels start to slip, the computer cuts power. That's smart engineering. It prevents damage, extends machine life. But it also means there's a limit to what those machines will do. They'll work up to a point, and then they'll stop. They won't destroy themselves trying. And your steamer, my steamer doesn't know any better. It just pulls. If I tell it to pull until something breaks, it'll pull until something breaks. The only computer is me, and I know when to stop and when to keep going. Frank was quiet for a long time. I spent 30 years in this business, he said finally. Built my company from nothing. Always believed that newer was better, that more technology meant more capability. Yesterday, a machine from 1912 did what my million-dollar equipment couldn't do. Your equipment is better for most things, Walter said. Faster, more precise, easier to operate. But there are some jobs where the old ways still work best. The trick is knowing which jobs those are. How much do I owe you? I told you donation to the Historical Society. How much of a donation? Walter thought about it.
What do you think 3 days of delays cost you?
Close to $70,000. Then give them $10,000. That's more money than they've ever seen. They can use it to preserve machines like this one. Machines that people laugh at until they need them. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote the check without hesitating, tore it off, and handed it to Walter. $10,000 to the Clayton County Historical Society, Frank said. And my personal thanks. I won't forget what you did. Most people forget. I won't. Frank looked at the steam engine one more time. You know what I learned yesterday? I learned that my great-grandfather was smarter than me. He didn't have computers or hydraulics or any of the things I thought were essential. He just had machines like this one, and the knowledge of how to use them. He was smarter than both of us, Walter said. He built a world that worked. We just inherited it. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because Walter Brennan became something he never expected to become, famous. The story of the swamp rescue spread far beyond Clayton County. A reporter from the Des Moines Register came out to interview Walter, then a television crew from Cedar Rapids. By the end of October, the steam engine had been featured in 3 newspapers, 2 TV segments, and a magazine article about vintage technology making a comeback. The phone started ringing. Construction companies, logging operations, farmers with equipment stuck in impossible places, they all called Walter, asking if he could help. Most of the jobs were beyond his range. He couldn't exactly drive a steam tractor to Minnesota, but some were local, and Walter never said no. Over the next 5 years, Walter Brennan and his 1912 Case steam engine pulled out 11 pieces of modern equipment that nothing else could move. 2 excavators, a bulldozer, a cement truck, 4 grain trucks, and 3 combines that had gotten stuck in the same swamp on the same farm 3 years running. You'd think they'd learn, Walter said after the 3rd combine. He never charged for the work. Every rescue ended the same way, a donation to the Clayton County Historical Society, whatever the owner could afford. By 1997, the society had enough money to build a proper museum, a building dedicated to preserving the steam-powered equipment that had built the Midwest. Walter's case was the centerpiece of the collection. Not permanently, Walter still kept the engine at his farm, still fired it up once a month, still drove it to county fairs and steam shows. But the museum built a special display for it, with photographs of the swamp rescue and testimonials from the people Walter had helped. The plaque on the display read, Case Steam Traction Engine, 1912, owner Walter Brennan. This machine was built before World War I and is still working today. It has rescued over $1 million in modern equipment from situations that modern technology couldn't solve. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. Let me tell you about one last thing, because it happened in 2001, the year Walter Brennan died. Walter was 72 years old when Frank Donnelly's excavator got stuck. He was 82 when his heart gave out on a September morning, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse where he'd spent his entire life. His son, Martin, found him there with a cup of coffee in his hand and a small smile on his face. The steam engine was visible from the porch, parked in its shed, the same place August Brennan had parked it 70 years before. The funeral was the biggest Clayton County had seen in decades. Frank Donnelly came, older now but still running his construction company. He told the story of the swamp rescue to anyone who would listen. "This man saved my business," Frank said. "Not just my excavator, my business. I was bleeding money. My reputation was on the line. And an old farmer with an older machine did what all my engineers said was impossible." After the funeral, Martin Brennan took over the farm and the steam engine. He'd grown up learning to operate it, learning to maintain it, learning the patience required to build steam and the skill required to use it. The first time he fired up the engine after his father's death, the whistle echoed across the Iowa flatland, just like it always had. But this time, Martin could have sworn he heard something different in the sound, not just steam escaping through brass, but his father's voice, and his grandfather's voice, and all the voices of the men who had stood where he was standing, hands on the throttle of a machine that refused to become obsolete. Let me tell you the final thing, because it's what Walter would have wanted you to know. The 1912 Case steam traction engine is still running. Martin Brennan still fires it up once a month. He still takes it to county fairs and steam shows. He still gets calls from people with equipment stuck in impossible places, and he still never says no. In 2015, 23 years after the original swamp rescue, Martin pulled out another Caterpillar excavator, this one belonging to Frank Donnelly's grandson, who had taken over the family construction company and made exactly the same mistake his grandfather had made. "Your grandfather warned me about this swamp," the young man said, watching the steam engine pull his excavator to safety. "He said the only thing that could get equipment out of here was your family's machine." "What did you say?" "I said that was ridiculous. That was 1992. We have better technology now." Martin smiled. "And how did that work out for you?" "About like you'd expect." The young man shook his head. "My grandfather was right. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to forget, and then they remind us." Martin shut down the engine and let out the whistle one last time. The sound echoed across the Iowa flatland, the same sound that had echoed there for over 100 years, the same sound that would echo there for 100 more if the Brennan family had anything to say about it. The engineers say that steam power is ancient history. The experts say that modern machines can do anything. The construction companies say that there's nothing their equipment can't handle. But somewhere in Clayton County, Iowa, there's a shed behind a barn where a 1912 Case steam traction engine sits waiting. Its boiler can still hold pressure. Its gears still turn. Its 6-foot drive wheels can still grip any surface and pull any weight. It's been there for over 100 years now. And every time someone says nothing can pull that out, the Brennan family fires up the engine, sounds the whistle, and proves them wrong. That's the story of the swamp rescue. The story of a machine that refused to become obsolete, and a family that refused to let it. The engineers laughed, the steam whistle answered, and the excavator came out of the mud. That's what happens when you underestimate something that was built to last.